Okay, so thanks everyone. So for our final panel, we are privileged to have with us Deb Markowitz to moderate the discussion. Deb is a visiting professor of environmental policy and leadership at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. She previously served as secretary of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and on the board of Reggie. So perfect person to guide us in this discussion. Deb, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you. The other piece of my resume, which is, I think, relevant, is I also spent 12 years as an elected Secretary of State for Vermont. So with reference to the prior panel, I really understand politics and how so much of what we've talked about today would be pie in the sky, except that we've got people who are aligned with us working hard on the political side. And it's great to be in academia. It's been an eye-opener for me, and it's great to be with MIT here today and so many smart thinkers on this topic. But it's also really important that we have with us folks who understand the politics of our communities and the region and can figure out how we actually move forward. And I would say that one of the pleasures of serving as the Secretary of an environmental agency in a state like Vermont that's made up of people whose identity is as environmentalists by and large, is that we really get to try new things. We get to innovate on the environment. And we're encouraged to go out and to find partners and to see if we could advance ambition. And that's so even right now. I'm very proud. We've got a Republican governor who's working with the Republican governor in Massachusetts to help the region continue to lead on climate change. So we'll be an example here of bipartisanship when it comes to climate solutions, I really believe. And with all of you in the audience pushing from behind, I think that would make a difference. So I think this panel is going to be an interesting panel. It's at the end of the day. We've already heard a lot, but this is the unicorn panel, right? When you talk with folks about, in this region, we like to boast about Reggie. There's a lot to boast about. It's a success story. When you talk among subnational partners, whether it's in Bonn or Paris and the climate accords or at the meeting that happened in Chicago just a week or so ago, the question always comes up, can we link? How do we link? And what linking really means, if you think about it as we start this conversation, it means that and it can mean a whole lot of things, right? It could mean that when we sell allowances in Reggie, that someone in the Western Climate Initiative could buy them and use them if they need them in their region. Like, how do you combine regions? Or do you actually combine programs? That's another piece of that trajectory. Or do you just combine pieces of the programs? Do you allow states or regions to pick and choose like from a menu of options? And we'll be talking about all of this. And then there's that other question about, well, what about the overlay of climate tax? Because I know in this area, there's a very vocal group of advocates who are pushing for a price on carbon, and we've got economists telling us that that's the best way to create behavioral change. And so what happens if there's some prices put on carbon? How does that overlay with the market approaches, Reggie and Western Climate Initiative? How does that work with other policies? So I'm hoping that this will be an interesting conversation for you. We've got really a great panel. We're starting with Chris Knittel, and he's the George Schultz Professor of Applied Economics and the Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research here at MIT. And then we're going to hear from Marie-Claude Francoeur. She's the Quebec delegate in Boston. So she is the representative here in Boston of the Quebecois government. So it's really wonderful. Bienvenue. Welcome. Then we've got Jason Hollett. He's the Executive Director of Climate Change for the province of Nova Scotia. And then finally, Paul Miller, who's the Deputy Director of NESCOM, and he's also their Chief Scientist. So we've got a sciencey person, which is nice. And NESCOM is the Association of Air Directors, although NESCOM stands for something else, which is, I think it stands for something, tell me if I'm wrong, the Northeastern States for Coordinated Air Use Management.
Everything except the
So there you go. So it's, but NESCOM is an organization in this area that has really helped the state leaders come together and collaborate. So it's really wonderful to have you on this panel. And I thought we would kick off the discussion with the economist among us to talk a little bit about price on carbon and why economists like that so much, what he thinks about it, what he thinks about market approaches, and just to give us a little starting context.
Sure. I'll never pass up an opportunity to sing the virtues of carbon pricing. So it is, we should start with why carbon pricing. So, you know, it's funny, economists are always, the joke about economists is we never agree about anything, right? And it turns out there's only one issue, maybe two issues that we agree, and the important one is carbon pricing. So it's unanimous across economists that the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is through a price on carbon. Now, it can come from either a carbon tax or a cap and trade, and I think later we might hit on what are the important differences across those two types of prices. But the reason why comes exactly from the reason why we like markets in the first place. So we know as economists that when consumers and firms face the true costs of their decisions, that markets are the best way to organize the exchange of goods and services. The problem with climate change is that consumers and firms aren't facing the true cost of their decisions, right? So when I pump a gallon of gasoline in my car, I pay for the oil, I pay for the refining, I pay for the transportation, but I don't pay for the 20 pounds of CO2 that get emitted into the atmosphere. So what a price on carbon does is it just makes me pay for the true cost of my decisions, right? So you can't be for markets, for capitalism, and against carbon pricing. It's just inconsistent with each other, right? The reason why we love capitalism is the exact reason why we need a carbon tax. And I think that's what's kind of missed among many policymakers. And in fact, in the 80s and 90s, it was the Republicans that loved pricing pollution. It was sulfur markets and NOx markets that were created under Republican regimes that were hailed as the most efficient way to reduce pollution. And that's all a carbon tax or a cap and trade system with greenhouse gas emissions would do. The last and how important is this? So let me just end with that there's a mountain of economic literature out there that compares the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions under pricing carbon and other policies. And what I can say is that the renewable fuel standard, according to my research, is 3 times more costly than a price on carbon that achieves the same reduction. CAFE standards, you might love fuel economy standards. It turns out that they're 5 to 10 times more expensive at reducing greenhouse gas emissions than a price on carbon. So another way to think about the virtues of a carbon tax is we could, for the same cost to society, we could do 5 to 10 times more abatement than we're currently doing. Or we could do the same amount of abatement and just save society 4/5 of the cost. So that's ultimately why economists favor carbon pricing.
So you're all convinced? And then
This is a selected set.
It is. And you've all read the book, I've forgotten the author, who talks about how we don't actually make rational decisions, right, in the world of economics, which is when, you know, we can't not like it. In fact, we know that there's a tremendous political lift when it comes to price on carbon, whether it's through markets, which seems to be easier, or a tax. But we'll talk about it a little bit more. What I thought was interesting is I learned as I was preparing for this panel that in Quebec, they've had a carbon tax, and I didn't realize that before. I knew that they were, newly or relatively newly partnered with California and the Western Climate Initiative to do the market approach, and so I'm wondering, Marie-Claude, if you could start by talking a little bit about your experience in Quebec with the carbon tax and the transformation and what you're doing now with the Western Climate Initiative, sort of the whys and the wherefores behind it.
Great, thank you. And thank you for having this wonderful conversation today. I'm very pleased to be here to represent the province of Quebec. Interestingly enough, when I'm invited to these things, I always get ceded to the brilliant, articulate economist. And then I have to speak. So I have no ego. That's a good thing. We did start with a carbon tax in 2006. What happened at the time was the Canadian federal government made a public statement that Canada was not going to be able to meet the Kyoto Protocol objectives. So the Quebec government, under the leadership of Première Charest at the time, decided that we were going to go forward and we were going to honor those objectives as a province. So 3 departments at the time were called into action. Transportation, because of course that's where the damage is done. In the province, we have 500,000 lakes, 4,500 rivers, 22% of the land is covered by water, and 75% of the people that heat their home or cool their home do it with energy that's produced with hydro or wind. So 99% of what we produce in energy is renewable energy. So, you know, we just needed to go and tackle where the problem was, and transportation definitely was at 44%. So what we did was to look at the polluter payer scheme and decided to adopt that. Now, we called it, in French, it's a redevance. In English, it's a levy, because no one gets elected where I come from saying we're going to raise taxes, because the opposition will say, it doesn't matter how you call it, it's a tax. But if you actually call it a tax, well, there's no way around it. So, and at the same time, what we did was create what we called a green fund, which was completely independent of government. And the money that was coming from the levy, which amounted to $200 million a year of new money, went into that green fund. And then we knew from the start that the money in that green fund was to be used for mitigation and adaptation, reduction of GHG emission. No one else in government can go and tap in there for health care, and we can talk about health care if you want outside. That's an expensive part of the proposition, education, and so on. So everything is dedicated to energy efficiency programs, adaptation, mitigation, and so on. So for those 6 years, we did have a carbon tax. We were the only legislature or province or state in North America to have such a tool. It only covered fossil fuels at the distribution level, which represented about 61 distributors. We needed to cover the rest of the economy. And in order to do that, we decided to look into the WCI and the Western Climate Initiative cap and trade system and market. So we would be able to cover more than just fossil fuels. So we moved from one to the other. We were for a year just within ourselves and doing auctions in Quebec. And in 2014, we linked with California. So last month, we had our 13th auction, and then again, it's a success. So the ton sells at $15. It increases in price every year by 5% and follows inflation as well.
That's great. And so the carbon tax is no longer?
No, it was rolled in. At one point, we were still running the market with the new industries. We were still running the tax. And then when we linked with California, everything went into one big lump.
So you might wonder, like, weren't our feelings hurt in Reggie that they went with California instead of their neighbors? I mean, we're on the border of Quebec, but then it was explained that since their electric sector is so green, Reggie was not really so necessary. Is that right? I mean, that's
correct.
So it's okay that you went with California. You might, if you follow the news in Canada, you'll know that their new leader is really focused on climate change and made some pronouncements about all of Canada really doubling down on the Canadian commitment to meet Paris. And And Jason Hollett from Nova Scotia is charged with implementing some of that within the province of Nova Scotia. So I was hoping that you would tell us a little bit about what's going on nationally, and then how you and your small province, because you have a very small population, is that right? That how you're thinking about meeting that obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll start with a really quick summary of what the directive that came from the federal government. And apologies, I'm from a province, not the federal government, so they can mark my performance afterwards and give me a grade on how well I represented it. But the story of what's happening in Canada right now is probably it's in three parts, or at least the most recent history, and it's pre-2015, the previous election. Many individual provinces were stepping up in the absence of federal government leadership on climate change and implementing their own policies and programs. So British Columbia had a carbon tax that was applied economy-wide. Quebec and then Ontario chose a cap and trade program, and more recently Alberta had a hybrid approach, which had a carbon levy and then a performance standard on industry. When the new government came in, they were elected on a platform that included carbon pricing, and began very quickly to have dialogue with the provinces and the territories on how that would look like and how that would roll out nationwide. And where they landed was a directive, or it's called a carbon pricing benchmark, where it says provinces and territories must have carbon pricing by 2018, and they can choose one of three tools. And they happen to be, not coincidentally, the three tools that were already existing in Canada, which was the carbon tax, like in British Columbia, the cap and trade model that Quebec and Ontario has adopted, and the hybrid approach that Alberta has. And the third part is that is being implemented right now. So we're late 2017. Provinces and territories have throughout the next year to implement their choice of systems. And if they don't adhere to the benchmark, then the federal government will implement their own backstop in place for the province to make sure that there's a consistent approach applied across the country. And just very quickly on Nova Scotia in particular, and we'll move on because we'll probably come back to that a little bit later on. And apologies to Chris. We had a regulatory approach in Nova Scotia prior to the federal government's direction that we thought was working fairly well. We had hard caps on our electricity sector, which was our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, requiring 55% reductions by 2030. We had renewable portfolios standards requiring 40% renewable energy by 2020. We had some energy efficiency. We created an energy efficiency agency modeled on some of the great work that happened in Vermont. That was reducing demand by about 1.2% per year on the electricity sector, 8% in total, which for those of you in the business knows that you're really avoiding the need to construct a new massive generation facility. And as a result, we saw 30% reductions, or we're at 30% reductions below 2005 levels right now. So when the federal government came out with the benchmark, we looked at the options that were out there, and because we had a capped electricity sector, what made the most sense for Nova Scotia was looking at cap and trade. So we're putting together a system that's modeled very closely based on what Quebec and Ontario have done, and have been working very closely with Quebec and Ontario, thanks for all your help, to have that in place in Nova Scotia by 2018.
That's great, thank you. So Paul, one of the things we've talked a lot about in this region is, if Reggie is really focused on, on the electric sector, and now our electric sector is pretty green, and like we've heard from other speakers, in most of the Northeast, the transportation sector and heating sector, well, transportation sector ends up being about 40%, and the heating and cooling fuels is another significant 25% or so in most places. And I know Thrun Escom, you're working with the air directors and the climate leads to think about how to address those sectors that aren't covered by Reggie.
Yeah, so let me start first by saying you introduced both my titles as the deputy director and senior scientist, and said I was a scientist up here. I'm actually going to do this talk wearing my deputy director hat, because that signals to you that I'm speaking as a senior manager, and that then consciously indicates to you that I know nothing about what I'm about to talk about. So I'm adjusting your expectations. So a little bit about Northeast states for coordinated air use management as context for those who don't know NESCOM, and my apologies to capitalism. We're also called NESCOMmies because we're old school command and control throughout our history, although we try to be flexible. So we actually, as an organization of state agencies, air agencies. We're not governmental, we are a membership organization. We've been around since 1967. We predate EPA in the United States. So we're an example, and I get to say we in the Supreme Court sense, take credit for everything that's gone before, whether I was there or not. We've been working cooperatively on a regional basis for now about 50 years. So I think it's a recognition of regional cooperation and a lot of the themes that have been talked about here, and for this panel and earlier panels, trying to extend a little bit more into what Canada is doing, especially in light of our current politics on the national level. So what we have been doing more specific with our states are the 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey. They have a bit of a range of where they're at in terms of commitments to greenhouse gas mitigation. And they range from actual state laws to achieve an 80% reduction economy-wide in greenhouse gases by 2050, as required in law, to aspirational goals. So they have the goals, but they don't have the backing of law necessarily to implement programs, although they are. So what we have been doing with 3 of our states that do have laws, and those states are Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, we've been doing some scenario analyses. What does it look like to achieve your 80% goal and maybe varying different midterm targets in 2030 to achieve on the way to those goals? And one of the things we find when we do this, and it's been said before, is like we think the technologies are all there. They may not be the technologies you actually use, but we put into our models, and they're not forecast models, they're scenarios. We put into these models basically renewables, electric vehicles, and other things, and show various ways, wedges to achieve those goals. Deb, you mentioned earlier about the way the inventories break out in our region, and in New England it's true. It was said earlier that nationally transportation just took over the electricity sector as the largest source of greenhouse gases in the United States. In New England, they're only in 3rd place in the electricity side. In Canada, they're in 4th place. So New England's about 20%. Heating and thermal load at buildings is about 30%, and transportation is about 40%. So when we're looking at this, Reggie, as good as it is, only covers 20% of our emissions. That's true for the individual states as well as the region. What Reggie does, and I believe in trying to connect us to carbon pricing, it provides a revenue mechanism to invest into complementary policies like energy efficiency and potentially other programs to help drive compliance with the cap. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the cap is actually driving the full range of reductions, but maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe the real key for a program like Reggie is the revenue part and in being able to reinvest it. So what I want to close with are the 2 things that we're trying to grapple with our states right now. That's transportation and the thermal load side for buildings. I won't get into transportation because you just heard about that. Thermal side, you haven't heard about, I think, all that much. In the New England area especially, a lot of the winter heat is provided by heating oil. That's essentially diesel with a different dye that's sold for transportation purposes. When we look to our scenarios for the various states, as I said earlier, the technologies we're assuming are all demonstrated for the most part. Heavy-duty transportation, we kind of had to make some big assumptions, but everything else seems to be there. What the challenge is turnover rates. How do you get these things into use? Electric vehicles and, in essence, heat pumps on the thermal side on a rate and an implementation level that's going to achieve both midterm and long-term targets. And we're nowhere near even initiating that now. One of the big challenges, especially on the thermal side, is the cost of heat pumps. Now, with electric vehicles, we're seeing great price reductions as the technology develops and improves and ranges improve and consumer acceptability seems to be improving, and then you're going to get economies of scale. On the heat pump side, that's potentially a pretty mature technology, and it's about $10,000 a shot last time we looked for a heat pump. Most people aren't going to go out, although talking to Jason here in Nova Scotia, this isn't necessarily true, but most people aren't going to go out and buy a heat pump when their oil furnace or even their gas furnace ends its life. And these lifetimes of these units are about 15, maybe 20 years, depending on whether it's residential or commercial. So once they replace them, they're in there again for quite a bit of time. So how do we address that? How do we get people to make choices if that's where we want to go? It's fundamental on the electric side. Everything has to be decarbonized. You have to start with a decarbonized electric grid, or none of these other things are going to work. But how do you get these other things out into the market? So we talk in EVs, for example, with rebates. Where's the money coming from rebates? And for heat pumps, where's the money coming for people to buy heat pumps in lieu of some other choice they already have? So that gets to carbon pricing. We're not going to get taxes in most of our states or any of our states. But Reggie set the cap and trade example. How do you extend something like that to generate revenue? Even if the cap isn't set it away, that's actually going to drive down emissions. Maybe the cap is there to drive up revenue. Use that revenue. Invest into these other sectors, but it has to be at a level that's going to drive the rate of turnover that's going to be needed to meet some really aggressive targets that these states and I think Canada as well are going to have to achieve in order to reasonably get close to a 2050, 80% reduction.
So those of us, and Reggie boast a lot about how much Reggie has driven emissions down. I think it's, I don't know if Jared's not here, 35% or 36%, I forget, it's in the high 30s, right? It's significant. And there was an independent review to look at how much of that was due to actual the carbon pricing policy versus just what was happening in the region with the economic downturn and use of natural gas and that replacing more polluting fuels. And the analysis determined that about half of it was due to Reggie. But a further analysis showed that a bunch of that was because of this virtual cycle of investment, that the proceeds were being invested in ways that added to the greenhouse gas reduction. So one of the things we learned is that it's important to raise revenue to help pay for things that are hard to pay for otherwise. Like in Vermont, we use our Reggie revenue with an environmental justice frame. We use it to weatherize houses. In New England, we've got some, and I would bet in Quebec as well, some of the oldest housing stock in the country, and which means that it's not efficient. There are challenges with heat pumps in that when it's really cold, they're not going to actually do the trick yet. They're still working on the technology. Having revenue to redeploy in these ways is really going to be important going forward. And while you're skeptical about, he said, we're never going to have a carbon tax. Well, maybe not, but maybe. And I know in Massachusetts, there's a proposal that's been floating that you've been doing perhaps some consulting on and discussions with the folks who are working on it. And it would be interesting to hear from you sort of what's in that proposal. And does it raise revenue? I know in Vermont, whenever they're suggesting a carbon tax proposal, it actually is touted as being revenue neutral, which doesn't get to the raising revenue for reinvestment. And do you think that in Massachusetts, in this climate, there's a chance for it?
Yeah, so let me first flag that for discussion later, I fear we're not fully embracing the power of the carbon tax or carbon price if we only view it as a source of revenue. So I do want to have a discussion of the virtues of actually changing behavior through the price itself. So I wouldn't say I'm consulting on this, but I will say that I am the neighbor of one of the authors of one of the carbon tax bills. So there's two bills on the floor right now.
So when you walk your dogs together, you're sort of consulting.
Yes,
yeah.
that's how I go. And in fact, Senator Michael Barrett is right in the front row, and he's the author.
You have a nice dog.
He's the author of one of the bills, and Representative Benson is the author of the second bill. And I would say, and Senator Barrett will yell at me if I misrepresent things, but they're very close, except for what they do with the revenue. And obviously, this whole discussion has been about what we do with the revenue. From the economist's perspective, it's less about what we do with the revenue and more about getting the right price. So from my perspective, what we do with the revenue should be driven by what's most politically feasible of getting it passed. That is to say, if it's easier to get a carbon tax passed by giving all of the money back in terms of a dividend, let's go that way. If it's easier to get it passed by setting aside some of the money for energy efficiency investments or solar subsidies and so on, let's go with that way. So these two bills, Senator Barrett's bill is what he would call a fee and dividend. It's a levy/fee and not a tax. And it generates the revenue and gives it all back in terms of lump sum payments to households based on household size. So it's revenue neutral and much like British Columbia's carbon tax.
And is it high enough to create the behavior change that you think?
So it would start at $10 and then incrementally increase up to $40 from there. And then Representative Benson's bill, as I understand it, sets aside some of the money for some of the programs that we're talking about here.
And so what rate would a tax actually affect behavior?
So this is why we're not fully embracing the power of the carbon tax. So at any rate, it affects behavior. So a lot of my work is empirical in nature and focuses, for example, on how consumers respond to changes in gas prices. And what you find is if gas prices go up by 5 cents, consumers change their behavior. If they go up by 10 cents, they change their behavior more. But they change their behavior in terms of what cars they buy, how they use their cars, how long they drive their cars, and so on. So behavior is changed at the starting point. Obviously, a $40 carbon tax, which is about a 40-cent a gallon gasoline tax, is going to have a bigger behavioral change than a $10 carbon tax. But the beauty of a carbon tax or carbon price, and I immediately go to carbon tax, so you should hear it as carbon price, is that it changes all of the behavior we want to change, right? So imagine increasing the price of gasoline by 40 cents. What we know from the empirical literature is we buy more fuel-efficient cars, we drive fewer miles, we scrap less fuel-efficient cars quicker. I had a graduate student that looked at the price of homes. When gas prices go up, the price of homes in bedroom communities go down. Because what's that saying? People move closer to their jobs when the price of gasoline goes up. All of the behavioral changes we want to put in place happen under a carbon tax. That is not the case under any other policy. Think about fuel economy standards. Fuel economy standards put me in a more fuel-efficient car. Guess what I do as soon as I get a more fuel-efficient car? I drive more miles. Guess what happens to the price of used F-150s? They go up. Those F-150s, used F-150s, stay on the road longer because it's harder to buy a new F-150, right? So any other policy other than a price on carbon always has unintended consequences that push away from abating carbon. That's why, we can argue what we want to do with the money, but we have to view a price on carbon as the first order effect is changing our behavior and reducing climate, not funding other policies.
So what I find that is interesting about this conversation is there really is a difference between how we think about a price on carbon when it comes to the kinds of fuels that are used in our personal lives. We make millions of these small decisions. Millions of us make millions of small decisions every day. How high do we turn on the heat? How far do we drive? Do we take an Uber? Do we whatever? what's different about the electric sector is it's a regulatory industry. And one of the things that I love about Reggie and the market-based approach is you can say, okay, we are going to cap emissions. So we know we're going to get results because by regulation, and maybe it's that I'm a lawyer and when you're, it's like every tool I see is regulation because I'm a lawyer, but I love regulation. And I'm not in politics anymore, so you can quote me on that. But the benefit of the regulatory frame is you can actually be certain that you're going to get the carbon savings because you regulate it. And in this context, it makes some good sense because you only have so many regulated entities. So the challenge that I'm interested in hearing about maybe from Marie-Claude is, with WCI, they're not just regulating the energy sector, but also it's an all-fuel sector. So it's regulating the heating fuels and the transportation fuels. So it's a regulation that's impacting all of those millions of little consumer decisions. And you've experienced both, right? So you had a carbon tax, but it was pretty low. It was a revenue generator. It wasn't necessarily meant to be a behavior changer, it sounds like. So with this new WCI, what's your thinking about this?
Well, it's interesting, and I just want to point out, if you wanted to know how you change behavior price on carbon, on fuel, come and fill up your car in Quebec. I mean, we just to give you an example, if I fill up here, it costs me $45. Last time I was there, it cost me $110. And this has nothing to do with carbon pricing, it's taxes and whatnot, because when we're talking about taxing fuel right now, it's $0.01 a liter. So imagine the discrepancy. So invisible. Pretty much in that regard. So behavior has been changed already just because of other taxes, either at the provincial government or at the federal level. And to prove that, Quebec represents 26% of the Canadian population. We have 50% of the EV fleet in Canada. So you're talking about change of behavior. So all these taxes that we've been paying for years, pushed us in that direction. So, we're already there. You don't have to increase that to make us change our behavior. And, the better your transportation, your public transportation system is, the more you get people out of their car. Massachusetts and Quebec are very similar in sizes and population as well, and also in traffic pattern around Montreal. It's very similar. Unless you want to give more money to your personal therapist, you want to stay out of your car around Montreal. So it depends where you want to put your assets. But that's to that point. So the money that we have been getting into, we're talking about revenue, what do you do with it? We are able to up the antes and make better public transportation. And when people get better public transportation, they take it. They want to have that space where they can text in the morning and not have to worry about other things. So that has been proven. We've experienced that. Now, when you're asking, what did it do for industry? Because that's who we were targeting. We do have pulp and paper. We do have mining. We do have a lot of very highly consuming, generating manufacturing plants. So between 2012 and 2016, they have dropped their GHG emission by 6.8% since we rolled in the tax and started with the carbon market. So they knew what was coming. We sat with them when we designed our regulation and our market scheme. They were part of it. There was strong political leadership. That's the key. We've had many points this morning that were brought up. Political leadership is key. So basically, industry was told that that's the way the train was going. They had to be on board to help design. If they weren't, not to come and lobby 2 years down the road, because that was going to happen anyways. So once that was said, everyone got on board. Everyone sat on the different tables. We had 10 different sectoral tables to come up with the pattern and the way we were going to go with it, and they all bought into it. So ultimately, it did give results. And as I said earlier, 85% of our economy is covered by the cap and trade system right now.
So I think one of my takeaways is that there at some point was an appetite for significant taxes on fuels. And that drove behavior in the transportation sector. And so really the WCI is beginning to put that on steroids and drive behavior in the industrial sectors. That's interesting. And especially for me in Vermont, where we don't, unless you consider dairy, we don't really have an industrial sector, with the few exceptions that are of concern. For Nova Scotia, as you're just rolling out your system, how much are you relying on in the future being able to interlock with Quebec or other provinces? Are you thinking that you're going to be going it alone? I assume that you also have some tax already on petrol and on gas, and it would be interesting for us to hear, as a smaller, really rural province, what you see in the future.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And just for context, Nova Scotia is the second most easterly province. Newfoundland owns the championship for being as far out east for Canada. And population less than 1 million people. We've got one major urban center and then a fairly rural province. And similar to Quebec, historically high prices of gasoline and diesel, and that's a mixture of location, refining costs, and taxation. Unlike Quebec, however, we have some of the highest electricity rates in the country as well, and that's due to the generation fleet that we have and the lack of access to some of the lower cost natural resources like hydro and other jurisdictions. So cap and trade is an administratively large piece of work to undertake for a small jurisdiction. So we are relying heavily on the work that has been done through WCI, Quebec and Ontario and California, and experiences even in other jurisdictions as well. So we've looked as far abroad as New Zealand and the EUTS just to get an idea of what the experiences are and what the pitfalls are to some approaches that may be out there. So we're building the system with an eye to the future. For the short term, it will be internal to Nova Scotia, so it'll be a relatively small system. And in the short term, we don't have raising revenue is not an objective of the program that we're having. We're focusing on GHG outcomes. And a lot of that is because we have achieved some fairly deep reductions so far. So the purpose right now is to bring in those other sectors that we currently aren't covering through regulation or haven't traditionally covered through regulation. That includes transportation, home heating, and industry. The advantage of working closely and adopting the policies and procedures of other jurisdictions is that they've been tried and tested. So you know what the impacts are. That's number one. And number two, when you're dealing with national and multinational actors in your jurisdictions, the companies or the not-for-profits, they understand that system. So they can come to the table with the knowledge and already educated on how it works. So when you're communicating with them, you're saying, well, here are the things that we're going to do that Quebec and Ontario is already doing. And they'll say, okay, yeah, we understand that. We do that already. And here is the nuance for Nova Scotia that we're going to do. And here's why. And here's the context behind that. So that's extremely helpful.
That's great. One of the challenges in Reggie is that it is a patchwork program. It's not really a single program, but rather it represents separate interlocking programs of each state. And that's in part because of there's a clause in the Constitution that prevents states from entering into interstate compacts without congressional approval, which, as you can imagine, would be hard to get, particularly now, but even when Reggie was first being formed. And there's pros and cons to that. It really does mean that the states who are part of Reggie have to work very closely together to come to consensus around the programs. But it also makes it difficult to move into these other fuel areas in the same sort of as a Reggie scheme. And Paul, as somebody who's worked closely with the states in the Northeast region that are part of Reggie. Are you optimistic that that there'll be a point when there'll be a coalition of states like Reggie in the Northeast who are putting a market on other fuels outside the electric sector? And then I'm going to come back to Marie-Claude actually to ask her about this interlocking with WCI and what she might see in the horizon.
Yeah, so here's why I changed titles to be chief scientist, so I can claim to be policy neutral. I'm agnostic about policy, and I will genuflect before the altar of carbon taxes. Yes. So I have to be optimistic. I think that there are a number of states that do have this as a matter of law. And I'm going to be optimistic and say if they passed the law, they were actually intended to achieve the goals of that law. What I see or hear from, and it comes in terms of the whole pricing of carbon, I think that one of the challenges, Reggie, politically, putting aside the policy of it, politically, there's now ownership in the revenue, which is, I'm getting the sense it's hard for the Reggie states to give up on Reggie to go to economy-wide and do something, say with WCI, which is an economy-wide cap and trade program. And similarly, because this is about regional or international transborder type programs, looking to Canada and the Pan-Canada framework, which is a carbon pricing mechanism that you can meet either through a carbon price or through a cap and trade program, more or less equivalent. So yeah, how to sort of get over that? You heard in the earlier panel about looking at transportation as its own silo, and then are they going to look at heating or buildings as its own silo? So I do see, at least in this region amongst the states, a little bit of trepidation for whatever reason. Once you get some money in your hand, it's hard to let go, to sort of like make that next jump. But I think in the realities of the situation, they're going to have to. So I'm looking at things like the Pan-Canada framework, and this is all premised on the federal level in the United States. We're not going to have a national program. Once again, I'm being pessimistic, but I think reasonably pessimistic over the next 4 years, that anything's going to happen there. So what are the opportunities for the states to expand into cross-sector type programs, WCI, or the Pan-Canada framework? Then I'm thinking, well, and this is where I made, now I'm speaking as a lawyer because I did make the mistake of going to law school. The challenge, and it was brought up earlier by Jared Snyder from New York, is we have this thing called a constitution, and that makes it hard for states to do international agreements or even amongst themselves that have real commitments. They can do it voluntarily. So Canada has this infrastructure, looks appealing. But I can see from Canada's point of view, is like, why deal with the states? Because they're going to be volunteers. They may just screw everything up. They'll have some voluntary commitment. They won't meet it, and we'll dilute all our resources. So I can see that being a challenge, but that also being potentially an opportunity. Then I'm thinking, from the Canada framework perspective, historically, and I used to work in Montreal for 5 years, historically on things like environmental programs, especially air programs, Canada tended to wait for the United States, the EPA especially, to do something. And then Canada, being roughly 30 million people versus 300 million people in the economy of the United States, would adopt whatever went on, especially in things like car standards, et cetera. I think the role has to be reversed now. And I think Canada might see an opportunity, I don't know, of you've got a program in place. You're implementing it starting next year. What's the constituency you can generate in the United States for that time when the United States does get back to doing a national program? So you've got a constituency in the States to promote those kind of measures that Canada is doing, rather than potentially having to throw everything out if the future United States comes in and says, we're going to do it my way and forget whatever else people are doing. So there's that kind of back and forth in my mind of how carbon pricing might be an advantage for Canada to extend to the United States to the extent we can get our Reggie states to think about broadening outside of Reggie. So there are, going back to your initial question, yes, I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't really care how it gets there. I do think a cap, even if it's not necessarily driving carbon down by itself, is a carbon price. So I don't think that necessarily disagrees. My biggest concern, to reiterate, is the rate of implementation that it's going to take for fleet turnover, for furnace turnover, and the scale that needs to occur now. For example, in Connecticut, you need about, by 2030, you need about 30 to 40% of vehicles on the road to be zero carbon. You need new cells in 2030 to be about 50% of your new cells. That's 12 years away. That's a lot of zero carbon electric cars. How are you going to get that going?
So we better get to work,
Yeah.
in other words. So the question is, I know you hurt our feelings by going with California. Is it possible, one of the things we grapple with Reggie, can we have it all? Can we stay in Reggie and not give up the revenue that we're already using and take advantage of WCI for the other fuel sources? Is that something that is regulatorily possible?
You can have two loves.
Such a French thing to say.
I know. So yes, you could. So, because Reggie has been working well, you want to get new members. Maybe those new members just want to have it limited to the energy sector. And if you're thinking of embracing another sector that might shy them away, maybe you just want to look at a completely different system, and you could just do it as a sector. So if you're going with WCI, you don't have to apply it to everything. You could just say, we just want to have industry covered by it, and that's what Manitoba is looking at it right now. So they will not do the full scheme. They're looking at industry. So, and the work that has been done, because some people have mentioned, how do you do the international thing? Well, it took us 6 years with California to come up with the program. And we come from a civil code background in French, and they have common law in English. Now, trying to reconcile that in regulation was some serious work for lawyers. But they succeeded, and they've done a fantastic job. So what comes out of that is that those regulations and the wording can be used either on the Canadian side or the American side. So whoever is coming in and wants to join has the paperwork done and a good framework to start with. So, and then it's pretty much, at this point, and plug and play. It costs $100,000 to join WCI. You get a seat at the board, and you keep the reins on your policy making. You decide what goes into the program. You sit together with the other people, make sure that everything works fine and is functionable and tracked and so on and so forth. And ultimately, there is room for other people to join. So being part of Reggie does not preclude you from joining in with WCI at this point. You could definitely do both, and that might be an easier solution than trying to, move Reggie, which is a different system.
So I think that's the most promising piece of news of this conference, right? Optimistic, and thinking about whether or not there is a scenario where we can make it easy for jurisdictions to link together. And my question then for the economist is, does this kind of piecemeal scheme work? Like, is that if the objective is to decarbonize, is the picking and choosing? Granted, maybe it's less efficient, right, but is this an option that you would recommend?
So again, any carbon price anywhere in the economy is moving us in the right direction.
And actually, this is, you know how these markets work with auctions, that you're auctioning, these allowances. So is an auction going to be more effective the more jurisdictions that are participating, or does it dilute it? And I'm afraid
the auction doesn't dilute it. What the auction does is it converts the allowances into revenue that the government can use. So from that perspective, I think I lost my. So the auction doesn't dilute things. What it does is it generates revenue. And the other thing, going back to California, remember the first 4 years of California's cap and trade program, fuels weren't involved. Right. So California is more than happy to add in other sectors, even if or other jurisdictions, even if they're one or two sectors. The advantage of going economy-wide, obviously, is that you let the market find where the most efficient reductions come from. So if you were to only have fuels under the cap, then that's not allowing other sectors, whether it's heating or electricity, to find the cheapest and most efficient ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So let me ask again, when the auctions are very carefully devised, and is there more power in an auction? Do you end up getting more revenue the more jurisdictions are participating in that auction?
So, yeah.
Or should Massachusetts kind of go it alone? And
yeah.
So is there some value in connecting?
Yeah. So I want to at least give an example of actually where expanding the cap and trade program can be bad. So suppose a scenario where Jerry Brown doesn't win re-election and someone, I don't know, with the initials of DJT, wins the governorship of California, okay? So we have cap and trade on the books. California has to do cap and trade, but that new governor doesn't really want cap and trade. So he or she can go through the process of eliminating it. Let's say they can't do that. One other way to water down that cap and trade program is actually to partner with somebody whose cap is way more than their emissions. Right? So what have you just done is you've reduced allowance prices, right? Because you've added in this new jurisdiction that has a zero carbon price, effectively a negative carbon price. So one concern, I'm not saying it's likely, but one concern is that if you allow these cap and trade programs to grow and somebody in the current cap and trade really didn't want that program, they could be strategic in terms of who they partner. And that's not going on now because obviously Governor Brown wants the program and wants it to be effective. But if Governor Brown didn't want it to be effective, they can team up with Oklahoma, and Oklahoma could define their cap as 5 times their current emissions. And what that would do is it would relax what California has to do in terms of abatement.
And so from a regulatory perspective, that there could be things that prevent that kind of trickery. In addition, it would seem to me that just like the Reggie states really love the revenue, the chance in California that you have a new governor that doesn't really love the revenue of whatever stripe is makes that less likely.
Yeah, and in fact, going back to the previous comment, what partly saved, California's cap and trade program was up for review this year, and what saved it, from what I understand, was the fact that people were locked into the money, right? So that's a beautiful, and what saves the carbon tax in British Columbia is probably some of those households like getting that check every year.
And so that's a lesson actually for folks who are pursuing carbon tax, that if it becomes revenue neutral, then you don't have that piece in place that maybe keep folks committed.
Well, except if they're getting a check.
Okay, it's true. So it's revenue. So if it's going straight into people's pocketbooks, then you're never changing it.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Questions from the audience? Oh, we've got a few. So we've got mics coming around.
Thank you, Gabriel Marty, climate change and energy analyst. That's great panel, great question on debating the merits of the carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is, I think we can all agree, is pretty awesome. It does have one drawback, though. I'd like to have your take on that, which is it's a scheme. Whether it's more obvious with the carbon tax than the cap and trade, but it tends to be kind of regressive, which is I see you don't agree with that, so definitely I want to have your take on that. But nonetheless, so we can have a debate whether it is or not. But nonetheless, what are the provisions which are considered, whether in the upcoming Massachusetts carbon tax proposals or the carbon trade schemes which are already in place or upcoming in the Quebec provinces? Thank you.
Could I just point,
Absolutely.
just really quick, that yes, any tax on energy is regressive if you ignore the revenue, right? So but we can't ignore the revenue. So it turns out a bill like Senator Barrett's bill that takes the revenue in and sends it out immediately to the households, proportional to the size of the household or just households in general, is a progressive policy. And it should always be our first concern with any carbon pricing scheme in terms of how regressive it's going to be. And it should be across the board. So not to beat up on other policies, but how progressive do you think subsidizing electric vehicles are, right? So I believe it was in 2015, 80% of the people who bought Teslas made over $1 million a year. And we were giving them $7,500 of federal tax revenue available. Why don't we worry about progressivity or regressivity when we think about other policies? Funding solar panels on rooftops. Who's putting those solar panels on rooftops? It's not the low-income consumers, right? So we should always worry about the regressivity of policies, but it should be across the board. And I fear sometimes we don't worry about those in terms of when we hand out money.
Do you want to talk to that, either of you, from Jason or Marie-Claude?
I'll just really quickly, I mean, energy poverty is an issue no matter what, and a tax or a price can exacerbate that problem. And it is a question of what you do with the revenues. In Nova Scotia, even without carbon pricing revenues, we've worked with our energy efficiency utility to focus on low-income houses to make sure that we're retrofitting those. So you're getting at the systemic issues of the problems. And similar to New England, we have a very old housing stock, and a lot of some of our houses where I'm from on the South Shore were actually insulated with seaweed. So you tear them apart, and you've got the seaweed that's collapsed inside of them. So you focus your programs, and what we've done before carbon pricing has been in place is we focused our programs on addressing those systemic issues of energy poverty, and making sure that you're helping the most vulnerable in your communities.
Maybe I can just point out, I'll take it from a very macro perspective. Because we have revenue that is generated, our green economy has grown tremendously. Quebec used to be in the doghouse when it came to Canada, as far as how much revenue we generated and how wealthy we were. Yesterday, the numbers came out. Our unemployment rate is at 5.4. It's unheard of since 1976, and it's been like that and dropping for the last year. Not only that, the green economy has created 43,000 jobs in areas that are good paying jobs. So, to draw that circle around, what we've been able to do is create wealth, which benefits everyone because we do have health care and we do have an education system. And, that's where that money is going. So.
Right. And Reggie, the statistics on Reggie is that it's created, I think, $2.9 billion of economic activity. And where the revenues went in many places were in part of that green energy economy, creating jobs, mostly construction jobs, putting up solar panels. So there is that, in Reggie they call it the virtuous cycle as part of it. But it is important to keep in mind whenever you're developing a new revenue source, particularly if it's one that's designed to drive up costs in one place, one part of the economy.
Stacey Vandiver from UMass Boston, the McCormick School. Just a quick couple of follow-ups. So I don't think the environmental policy literature supports the idea that what you do with the money doesn't matter very much. It seems to me that there's a lot of pretty good research, especially on the European cases, that particularly at relatively low taxes, and I don't think economists like to model $100 a ton and $50 a ton, but the senator's bill is not $100 a ton. So I mean, at the price points that are realistic, it seems to me the evidence is pretty clear that spending the money on things that reduce the carbon is the way to achieve the maximum amount of carbon reductions with the lowest amount of dollars, right? And so so that's the one point. The second point is that when we live as we do in parts of the world that are vastly underinvested in terms of the bills of what we need to do for climate change adaptation and energy efficiency, I gotta say that the revenue neutral argument sounds to me like a really bad policy idea. It sounds, again, like an idea that's designed to get something passed, but it locks in bad policy. And the last bit is that, you know, I am old enough to remember that 20 years ago, revenue neutral carbon taxes were going to be how we brought Republicans on board to this idea, right? And so that argument's 20 years old and still not happening. So I feel like if you can't say there are jobs here, if you can't say people are putting in new windows, if you can't say there are real investments, I'm not sure that the idea that how you spend the money is a relatively neutral thing. I think that's generally a bad idea. Now the senator has a comment.
So let me clarify. Certainly what you do with the money matters. What I'm saying is economists think of this as a two-step process. The first job of a carbon tax is to get the prices right? To get the right behavior on the use of carbon, right? Obviously, here's a way to maximize CO2 reductions. Massachusetts passes a carbon tax, use the money to go to California, buy a bunch of permits and tear them up, right? That would lead to huge reductions, right? Because it would make California's cap even stronger. So that obviously what you do with the money matters for CO2 reductions. But once you generate a carbon tax, the real question is, what's the best use of that revenue? It might be to subsidize solar panels. It might be to subsidize energy efficiency. It might also be to invest it in schools. It might also be to reduce income taxes, right? That we can, once we generate that money, those revenues, I say we fight over the best use of that revenue. If our only goal in life is to reduce CO2 emissions, then surely you would never invest it in schools. But from my perspective, you get the price right on carbon dioxide, and then you generate revenue, and you look for the best social return of that revenue. It might be to reduce CO2 emissions, but you know, I like good schools too, and I like good health care. It might be good to invest it in health care. That doesn't take away from the efficiency enhancement of the price on carbon. Once you've generated that price on carbon, those markets are operating more efficiently. So from that, once you've done that, conditioned on that, you have hopefully a rational argument as to what is the best use of a dollar bill in the revenue or pocketbooks of policymakers.
So yes, Senator.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your comments, Stacey. First of all, no policy can be considered in a vacuum. Take this statement as being in the nature of a question to our expert panel. No policy is to be considered in a vacuum, and every policy that one might consider is situation specific. We happen to be considering the prospect of carbon pricing for Massachusetts. Other things are happening in Massachusetts. We've all established that carbon pricing is a regressive way to raise money to put solar panels on roofs. It really hurts poor people. It so happens that in the 2018 ballot in Massachusetts, we have our first ever likely prospect of a progressive income tax, the so-called millionaire's tax. That's a progressive way of raising money to put panels on the roofs of people, poor people included, I might add. So if you're me, and 2018 follows after 2017, and you've got a progressive income tax on the ballot coincident with a proposal to tax carbon and drive down emissions, you can ideally have the best of both worlds. A progressive way of raising money to put solar panels on roofs, and a way that would be regressive other than that you're sending the money back, way to drive down emissions. Legislators are embracing a tandem approach. Use a progressive way to raise revenue, for the programs that these wonderful people have embraced, avoid a regressive way of raising revenue, but a way that's effective for reducing emissions. I kind of like the tandem. Right now, the polling shows that the millionaire's tax is doing extremely well. That's how I want to fund mass transit and solar panels. But I hesitate at using a regressive way of funding solar panels on roofs or mass transit. I prefer instead to rebate that money, knowing that to the economist's point, we drive down emissions whether we rebate the money or spend it. Better to rebate it, avoid the regressive impacts, drive down emissions. And the final thing I'll say is that we've calculated the price elasticity or inelasticity of putting a fee or a tax on carbon. I would gently repudiate Secretary Pollack. The price inelasticity of transportation is not zero. You don't double the price of a gallon of gasoline and see no impact on usage. She's absolutely wrong. As the economist points out, there is a price elasticity quotient here. You raise the price, usage goes down. It isn't one-to-one, but it happens. Take all that in the nature of a question.
So I think there's more questions on this side. Yeah, please chime in.
So
You want to answer that question?
I'm going to answer that question. No, I'm going to say two contradictory things. First off, with the regressiveness of incentives to, say, buy electric vehicles, I just want to reinforce the magnitude of the technology change that needs to happen. And so any kind of incentive program to encourage the sale of something zero carbon or cleaner that only millionaires can take advantage of is a failure, because it's nowhere near the scale that's going to be needed. And so there are options, there are ways to scale those kind of rebates, but the magnitude is just much larger than what we're used to thinking of. So that would be my response to the equity issue of incentives. It has to affect all levels of society, or else it's just going to fail anyway. Now, the contradictory thing going to taxes and looking again at carbon pricing on a regional scale. Legally, it's probably, you're on stronger legal grounds to do carbon taxes, carbon pricing on a state-by-state basis than trying to do regional programs like cap and trade. So that's another consideration out there. And that's the kind of things states that have these targets are grappling with, just to reinforce how difficult this really is.
So we have time for just a final question. And
Great. Well, thank you all for this panel. Found it very interesting. My name's Adam. I'm a grad student here at MIT in urban planning. And Paul, the point that you're making about the types of deep increases in these technologies, whether it's heat pumps or renewables or whatever, that I guess I'm curious, with the prices that exist now, or the prices of Senator Barrett's bill going up to $40, is that, how much of the 2030 targets will be possible through that, or will we need even higher prices after that initial period? I'm just having a difficult time understanding what the magnitude is of meeting those goals versus the prices that we see as politically feasible right now.
I will tell you, I have no idea. I would like to find out, but I have no idea what a carbon price, how high a carbon price needs to be to drive this level of turnover. And I will defer to the economist on the literature, because I don't follow the literature in that area. I don't even know if it exists.
So we have less of an idea, probably. But what we say is, look, innovation is very hard and very complex and takes a long time. And it might be the case that just a single carbon tax isn't enough. Okay, so economists view a price on carbon as the way to solve that externality. There might be other what we call market failures around innovation. The patent system isn't perfect. There's spillovers, whether it's at the R&D stage or at the learning by doing stage and so on. So if those are in place, which I believe at some level they are, then you need additional policies in and above that price on carbon. You can do it through an even higher price on carbon, but that's the less efficient way to do it. The more efficient way to overcome those other market failures is either fixing the patent system or subsidizing R&D or subsidizing production if it's coming through learning by doing. And I think policymakers should definitely consider those as additional market failures. But those market failures are only benefited through a price on carbon. So the first thing you got to start with is the price on carbon, and then you need to reassess whether you need additional policies to move innovation. And the likely answer is we do. And ironically enough, it tends to be much easier to hand out money than to tax, even though people, that money has to come from somewhere. And those tend to be the right policies for those types of innovation market failures.
It might be interesting for you as a student in planning to know that the states in this area who've joined on to some of these regional compacts, the under 2 MOU, are creating planning documents. They need to identify how they're going to meet their goal to reach their part of the sort of their piece of Paris, essentially, and be real specific about where those savings are coming from. And it's going to be in all of the above. We know that, and we've talked about that here. It's not just in the electric sector. It's in all of the fuels, and we need every tool. And from my perspective as somebody formerly in government, you need money to lubricate. And so any way you can get money in the system to lubricate, it would make a difference. So on that note, I want to thank this awesome panel. We're the last panel of the day. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us, and have a good evening.